So recently I've been reading this very interesting book which talks about the power of the internet and how you get people's attention and clickbait and all of these different things. And one of the points that the book makes is if you present things as a top 10 list, people find it really interesting. Think of all the top 10 lists that you've ever clicked on online. Top 10 Harry Potter characters, right? Top 10 whatever. So this is the Rabbi's Top 10 Haggadot for 2021. And for those of you who may not know, I am not what I would call a professional collector of Haggadot, but certainly I would argue I'm probably into the several dozens at this point. The head of USY, who I knew growing up, had several hundred in his collection. And I think if you go around the world, there are many, many people who collect, and I am always on the lookout for the next best, most interesting Haggadah to share with you and bring to the congregation. So the top is on the top. This is the best one of my top number one. So I'm going to start at the bottom. There is a collection that when I was in rabbinical school, if you're not familiar with it, is called the Torah Hayem collection of works. And the reason this one is on the bottom, or I placed it on the bottom, is because although it is one of my favorites, it is entirely in Hebrew. So I don't know how many of you might use it at your Seder, but what the Torah Hayem collection is known for is not in fact their Haggadot, but their collection of what is traditionally called the Mikraot Gedolot series of Chumashim. So what they'll do is they'll take, if you ever studied this as a kid in day school or even elsewhere, a very little snippet of text, if you've ever seen this kind of book, and lots of commentaries, medieval commentaries around it. Their pages look a little bit like this. And so their Haggadah reflects many of that same format model. And so what I like about this is if I'm looking for a sermon or a particular area, what this particular author does in this series is to glean all of the medieval and traditional commentators who have much to say about the Haggadah, and they put them in Hebrew. So as I said, it's quite a scholarly work, but what's also good about it is they have footnotes for where things come from, and makes it very, very interesting. So I'll leave it over here, and if folks want to take a look at my number 10 Haggadah, although I'd probably put it higher up on the list on mine, they can certainly do that. The next Haggadah has a personal connection to me, which is why I put it number 9, and this is the Rosenstein Haggadah. Some of you may remember that Mordechai Rosenstein was a scholar in residence here, or an artist in residence, quite a few years ago. It was during my time here, so it has to have been no more than 2 or 3 years ago. Mordechai Rosenstein is a Philadelphia-based Jewish artist. I have many of his stuff in my office. And in fact, if you walk in on the right from the chapel entrance, you'll see one of his pieces with a verse that I asked him to make for us. Specifically, it says, it's a book quote from Mishlei, from Proverbs. It's one of my wife's favorites. It says, "Come, throw in your lot with us, and let us have a common purse," or a common purpose, which I think is a great thing to look at when you're walking into a synagogue or walking in for minyan. So what I like about this particular Haggadah is really 2 things. First, the artwork is beautiful, of course, and characteristically, any Rosenstein piece that had to do with a particular part of the Haggadah, you will see illustrated inside. But the second is Shoshana Silverman is the editor, and she is a very, very talented Jewish scholar. And here you actually have some really fabulous commentaries and questions for discussion. So if you took part in our synagogue-wide Seder 2 years ago before the pandemic, these were where I got some of the questions from. Things like, the midwives Shifra and Pua performed the world's first recorded act of civil disobedience. Have you ever been involved with civil disobedience? Share the experience. And they're great questions to ask around your table. That's number 9. This one is one I suspect that most people in this room may be familiar with, And I want to apologize to those of you at home who may not be getting a Zoom view or a zoomed-in view. You may be getting a Zoom view, but not a zoomed-in view of the Haggadah. But this is the Rabbinical Assembly's Haggadah's Passover Feast of Freedom Haggadah. I'm just going to go on record as saying that I think the conservative movement needs to publish a new edition of this or a new Haggadah. It's probably from, well, I can tell you when it's from, because if you look inside, you see a little bit of a plaque that says this was given to Daniel Dorsch in 1995 for leading the Seder at Solomon Schechter Day School of Philadelphia. So that's how old this Haggadah is. I know 1995 doesn't seem like a long time ago for all of us in this room, but 25 years ago now, 26 years ago, it's still probably time for a new one. And what I like about this Haggadah in particular is really just one picture, which is why I always show it. And that is when it comes to the four children, for those of you who may not have seen this before. It's my favorite picture and depiction of the four children. And the point of this particular depiction is what, if you had to guess? We're all the same, right? Each of us has a little bit of the four children from the Seder within us. And so it's really one of my favorite depictions because although in my house I was the wise one, my brother was the wicked one, the other one was the simple, and my sister was the one who didn't know how to ask a question. P.S. The wicked one is now a rabbi in California. That's what happens when you go bad. You go to California. If you look over here, you'll see that in fact, in reality, all of us have a little bit of the four children within us. There's number 8. I'm going to admit number 7 is not that great, but it's totally nostalgia for me. This is the one I grew up with. This is the Goldberg edition of the Haggadah. It's probably one that you may have used with your children. It's simple. It's easy. Maxine, is it the one you use now, you were saying? It had a different cover, yes. It had a different cover. It went through several republishing by Katav, and the pictures are simple. But again, I don't really have much to add to this one. I put it at number 6, all because it's nostalgia for me. And yes, some of the covers were more beige-ish, yes. I don't know if it's in wide use now, but it's certainly one of the good ones. This is one that I have to admit I've never actually used as a Seder, but I admire its creativity. It's called the Baseball Haggadah, a festival of freedom and springtime in 15 innings. We have it in the library. It's always good to have our librarian here. Thank you, Janice. Yes, this morning. We do have it in the library, and I really do admire its creativity. Solomon Schechter is famously reported to have told his rabbinical students that if they wanted to understand the American rabbinate, that they needed to understand how to play the game of baseball, because baseball was so, for two reasons. First, these rabbis were European rabbis who really didn't know much about American society and wanted to stay in the shtetl. And his point was, well, if you didn't learn about America, then you couldn't be an American rabbi. But also because, there's a lot about baseball that ties into Judaism and it's not just that all of the owners and GMs of the sports teams are Jewish, right? In large part, it's because so many of the rules of baseball, in the sense of order, the idea of a lineup, all of these concepts that tie into Pesach quite nicely. So that's my next one. So 10, 9, 8, 7, that was 6. Number 5 is the Seder that we used last night if you joined us for our virtual Haggadah. This is put out by Michel Tzion and Noam Tzion and is loosely affiliated with the Hartman Institute in Israel. It's put out by Haggadahs R Us. And a quick funny note, Haggadahs R Us for a long time was the company that published the B'Kol Echad Bencher from United Synagogue. That was who we used to partner with. And I know that because that was my wife's job at United Synagogue. She used to do a lot of those Bencher orders for people's weddings. So if you look at this particular Haggadah, what makes it really wonderful is I think it has a big Zionist spin on it. And no more is that more prominent, I'm going to show you, than the Shulchan Aruch page of the Haggadah, where if you look carefully, it looks like a depiction of Jews across the world sitting at Seder. If you can't see it, you can zoom in later from home and watch this sermon on repeat. But it also has some great quotes from Israeli poets, Amos Oz, Also, you've got some Yiddish poets, I.B. Singer, American writers like Philip Roth. So many different beautiful quotes, and it's really, in many ways, an update of what I'm going to consider the number 2 Haggadah, although I like the number 2 on my list better. So, again, this is the one we used last night, so if you like it, go to Haggadah Zara so you can buy it. It's really beautiful illustrations and photos. Also in the library, there we go. This next one is one that I had mixed feelings about for a very long time, I'm not going to lie, because when I bought it, I thought it'd be really exciting, and the more that I use it, I appreciate it. It's called the New American Haggadah. I don't know how many of you remember when this came out, but what they did was to take 4 relatively unobservant, unconnected, I shouldn't say unobservant, that's not fair, observant in their own way, Jewish, not traditionally observant, Jewish writers from across the country and asked them to come together and put together a Haggadah based on sort of the 4 children. One of the writers of this Haggadah, for example, is Jeffrey Goldberg, who some of you may know is the editor of the Atlantic magazine. And the editor of the series is a writer who I had the pleasure of sitting down to for Seder when I was growing up. He was not really famous back then. He was just this kid with a big Jew fro. His name is Jonathan Safran Foer. Some of you may know some of his books, Everything is Illuminated, and other things. At the time, he was just getting started out. And what I love about this Haggadah, or appreciate about it, is if you look at the top of all of the pages, you will see a timeline of Jewish history and different persecutions and moments where we had our exodus that runs throughout. Other writers, by the way, in this Haggadah, Lemony Snicket from A Series of Unfortunate Events, and Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, who's more of a scholar, and that's why hers is called The Library, and Nathaniel Deutsch for The House of Study. So the art is very modern, but when I'm looking for something innovative and outside of the box to talk about, this is the Haggadah that I generally turn to. This is a gift that Debbie Deutsch and I decided to start giving our confirmation students every year for the past 2 years. And this is a new publication from Koren Publishers from Jerusalem. It is called the Passover Haggadah Graphic Novel. Some of you who may be in the education world know today that graphic novels are increasingly popular. That's what kids are using to learn, to read, to study. Graphic novels in some ways are fancy words for comic books. But if you look at this particular Haggadah that is beautifully illustrated by Jordan Garfinkel and Erez Tzadok, this is and I believe that Jordan Garfinkel went to Ramat Darom, by the way. There's some Ramat Darom connection with him as well, although I think he's Orthodox. There is a Ramat Darom connection. He went there, he was there for a summer, I don't know. He spent some time at Ramat. You will see this beautiful, beautiful Haggadah with fabulous pictures that tells the story. And when we talk about how we can translate the Haggadah story to the next generation in a language that kids can understand, I think there's no better way to do it than this. That's why we started giving this as a confirmation present because, here in the South, of course, Shavuot is generally during the summer, which is when confirmation would traditionally be. As Andrea can tell you, sometimes you celebrate Shavuot at camp with the kids, and the kids are out of school, so we pushed it back to around Pesach or close to Pesach, and so we've started giving this as a gift. Number 2 is the Different Night Haggadah, which is the classic. I suspect this is also in the library, Janice, if I had to make a bet. This is the one in many ways that, again, this is on a personal note, I think broke out our family Seder from the standard when I was growing up. My Zadie, who I love you Zadie if you're watching this morning, davened through the whole Seder to let's actually make the Seder a conversation and a discussion. And if you watching at home are, doing your Seder where you read the whole thing in Hebrew and daven it through from start to finish in English or Hebrew, there's of course nothing wrong with that. But if you're looking to break out of that mold a little bit and to have some meaningful conversations and have a very accessible, inexpensive Haggadah, again, this is also available on Haggadah Zar Us. It's so funny, the name, but especially since there's no Toys R Us anymore. It's kind of funny that there's a Haggadah's R Us, right? If you're looking for the family participation Haggadah, this is my number 2 on my list that I will go to. Which takes me last but not least to the Moss Haggadah. I suspect we don't have one of these in the library. They are incredibly expensive, and this was a wedding present from my childhood rabbi to Amy and I when we first got married. The actual Moss Haggadah is full of paper cuts, and it is very, very expensive. This one came with one. I have to admit we've lost it. Again, don't tell my childhood rabbi since we bought it. But it is a fully illustrated Haggadah by the author David Moss. And it's not just made to look like an illustrated manuscript. It's for those of you familiar with the bird's head Haggadah from the Middle Ages, you may know that there were Haggadot that were not drawn with human heads in the pictures because that was considered to be avodah zarah, idol worship, right? However, this is many ways tries to do much of that same piece here. But I want to show you my favorite page in the Haggadah that I use with our preschool students each and every year, which is why this is and continues to be my favorite Haggadah. I'm going to find that page, I promise. Here we go. Here it is. This is my favorite page in this Haggadah. Can anyone see what you're looking at inside? This text says, Bechol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. It means in every generation, human beings are obligated to see themselves as if they come out of Egypt. And if you look here, you'll see pictures of Jews throughout the different eras with their different clothing, how they may have dressed. So what do you think is in between here? Mirrors, that's right. And I show this to our preschool kids each and every year because they need to see themselves as the critical part of the story. And even for our preschool kids at that level, they can understand that this Haggadah is really all about them. So if you're looking for a really expensive work of art, the Moss Haggadah is your number 1. So there you have it, folks, my top 10 list. Maybe it'll go viral on the internet this year. Put it on BuzzFeed. Chag Sameach.